Hello and welcome to SuperMiata. Today we're going to talk about our new Zetas for the NC Zetas. That's the 2006 to 2015 second generation Miata. This is a new product for us. We released these about a month or two ago, and we're just now shipping the first batch, literally like today and tomorrow. So over the next week or so, those of you who have pre-orders in, look for those tracking numbers. So check your inbox. So those of you who are familiar with our brand, and maybe you've had an NA or NB Miata, the first generation, you're familiar with our Zetas for that car. Those have been around for about 12 years now, and they've seemed to have earned a reputation as kind of the gold standard aftermarket high performance shock for that platform. So there was a lot of anticipation when we announced that we were doing Zetas for the NC platform. A lot of interest, a lot of emails, a lot of inquiries, a lot of phone calls. We've definitely met that standard. I think a lot of it is that the NC is just a more refined car. It's a stiffer chassis, it's smoother, it's more comfortable, just a more solid feeling car altogether. The way they leave the factory stock, they're not really inspiring, but they really respond to a good shock absorber that allows you to keep that comfort and dial up the sharpness and responsiveness without adding adverse NVH. So really excited about the way these came out. So I'm going to talk about what comes in the box, the specifications of the shock, some of the features, some of the design process, and then we'll get into some little comparisons between these shocks and some of the other ones that are on the market. So first of all, what comes on the box? So this is a pair. This is the front and rear. This is the rear shock. We left they come with this neoprene sleeve that fits over them. I left it off this one display unit so you could see the shock's upside down. This is what the shock looks like underneath. So this is how it goes in the car. This is the body mount, and this is the control arm. But you see the cylinder is actually at the top and the shaft is at the bottom. We did that so that we could isolate the spring from the body mount. As a shock goes up and down through its travel, the control arm actually swings kind of in an arc like this. So the shock is actually following that control arm arc, and it moves back and forth a little bit of this, and of course the mount isn't moving, it's solid. So the shock itself has to be able to swing independently of the mount. So that's why, if you've ever wondered what a coaxial purchase, that's why this swings back and forth. It's just a couple degrees, but it's critical because it keeps the spring from binding here. There's all kinds of issues with spring binding that you eliminate by isolating the spring from the mount. We have a separate video on that, coaxial spring mounts. Look for that video. It goes into a lot more detail than we're going to do in this video, but essentially that's why we inverted it, just basically to separate these two. So that's a fully assembled shock. They're Swift mainsprings, helper springs. There's a Torrington bearing. I have a Torrington bearing here. You can see what this looks like. Torrington bearing is kind of like a Lazy Susan. It's these two washers here with this row of needle bearings. You can see that. And it's like a little sandwich. And that basically sits down on one end of the spring. What it does is it allows the spring to rotate freely. That's also in our coaxial spring perch video, but essentially when you compress a spring, it has basically a bit of a twisting moment. It's very slight, but if you resist that motion, it basically changes the spring rate. So you want to be able to allow the spring to twist a little bit. So you put a Torrington bearing on one side, and that allows that to happen. That's why these have Torrington bearings. So it's a small detail, they're not expensive, but it's one of the many little details that make up the shock. So the Swift mainsprings, these are 2.5-inch mainsprings. Now we have pre-configured spring packs. We've got a touring spring pack and a race spring pack, which I'll detail more in a minute. Those can be changed. They're standard 2.5-inch springs, so if you want to customize your springs, you can do a different spring pack. Comes fully assembled. These have a spherical bearing mount. The fronts, both the touring and the race, have a spherical bearing mount. This is the front assembly. Now this is traditional. This has the shock on the bottom. We didn't need to invert those because this distance is so small that we didn't need to make do that whole inverted structure. It still has a coaxial perch. You can see that mount is offset. So again, the front has the same thing where the control arm swings back and forth, and it has like an arc. So the shock is swinging back and forth relative to the body. So you need to have a mount that can basically pivot and isolate those forces from the spring. Comes with the rubber shock boot, same Torrington bearings and Swift springs. These are an aluminum bodied monotube shock. It's a 46mm digressive piston. And they are 20 clicks of damping adjustment here on the top on the front, and on the rear it's actually on the bottom of the shock. I'll show you this other rear here. Let's see if I can hold this up to the camera. You see that little orange thing down there? That's basically where 4mm Allen key goes in there. And when you orient this, that's either facing the back or the front. You want to put these with them facing the back so you can stick the Allen key in. There's 20 clicks. To learn more about the damping, the digressive pistons, and what that's all about, go to our damping video. There's a deep dive into the valving, kind of the philosophy, the way we design our shocks, and a lot more detail. These are fixed length shocks. These are single piece shocks, and we have another video. There was a lot to unpack here. And the reason we did all the separate videos is a lot of these features are what I call iceberg features, where you can just throw out one term, and if you don't know what it means, that it relates to a whole different level of performance. And if you don't know what the term means, then you don't know what's under the iceberg, essentially. So I think rather than basically cover every single iceberg in one video, make it an hour-long video, I thought it'd be best to separate them. So these are one-piece shocks, meaning that the cylinder and the mount are all one piece, and it doesn't use like an adapter to fit the car. The shock is actually built to fit the car. So this cap here is not a piece that you can like adjust. If you unscrew this, the oil comes flying out. This is actually the end of the shock, and then the mount is built right into it. So there's actually nitrogen volume going all the way down into here. It's all shock. As opposed to a two-piece shock, like the Ohlins DFE, or a lot of the shocks that are made in Taiwan, like the BC Racing stuff. This is a two-piece shock where it's a cartridge, and these cartridges, the shock manufacturers will just have a range of cartridges, and then they have like an adapter. So it's basically two pieces. So you have the shock and the mount are two separate pieces. It's like this, and it looks a little bit like our front shock, but the cartridge actually stops here. There's actually no shock here. They basically just have like a big extension here because the shock's too short. That's what you get with the two-piece shocks. So these are one-piece shocks. They do have a 3-year warranty. The service center is in Texas. For information regarding service, you can either contact us. We have an FAQ on the website. I think for your average user, average NC owners doing less than 10,000 miles a year, say if you're doing like 5,000 miles a year, don't drive it in wet weather so the shocks stay nice and clean. It's not being raced, it's mostly a street car. You're probably going to have to rebuild your shocks maybe once during that 10-year period, so maybe at about 5 years. If you drive it more than that, 10 or 15,000 miles a year, driving the rain a lot or doing a lot of track days where you're putting a lot of sustained heat in the shock, that's going to shorten the service life of them, and you might want to do it like say every 2 or 3 years. And the most extreme case would be pure race use where it's on the trailer and it's doing one endurance race a month all year long, so it's doing massive amount of track hours. Then you'd be rebuilding them once a year. But for most people, it's every 3 to 5 years. So figure if you have the car for 10 years, you have to service them once. Anyway, that's Inertia Laboratory. I guess I should start with just exactly what is a Xida. So a Xida is our private label brand. It's not a shock that we pull out of a catalog from somewhere else. That's something that we came up, we wanted to have our own shock design that was built to our specs. But we don't make shocks, so we had to do all the design work and then contact the shock company and say, hey, can you make these shocks for us? And we're going to call them Xida. So Xida is our own private label brand. These are made for us by Tractive, and if you haven't heard of Tractive, they're kind of in that same tier as basically all the pro motorsport shocks that you've heard of. Multimatic, Nitron, Penske, Moton, AST, so forth. All those high-end pro-level motorsport shocks that mainly focus on pro-level race team stuff. They do some consumer-level stuff, but typically it's through a dealer or through a specialty dealer. Tractive is in the Netherlands. So we had our own sort of design goals when we started these. So first thing we do with any new Xida project is we get a car. If you're a mass market shock supplier, you don't ever even have to have a car. You don't have to do any track testing. You don't have to have a race team. You don't any of the stuff that we do as a small development shop. None of that needs to be done with a mass market shock. Generally, if it's a two-piece shock, that's the way it's made. They don't do on-the-car shock development with race teams. That's just not the way those teams are done. Now, it isn't to say that you can't take those shocks, the best Taiwanese BC Racing shocks or an Ohlins, and modify them and make them better, but ultimately it's still a two-piece shock. It still has the limitations of a two-piece shock, still doesn't have a coaxial spring perch and so forth. So the first thing we do when we're starting a Xida project is get our hands in the car and do a kinematic study. And that means putting the car up on the hoist, pulling the spring out, leaving the wheel on it, and then cycling the suspension, full bump, full droop, and kind of measuring that, seeing what the motion ratio is going to be, seeing how much room there's, see if there's room for the tire to go further up past OEM bump travel, which is always desirable for a race car, and that's what we were able to achieve with the NC. So we're going to look at that, and then we're going to take the shock out and then see if it'll go further and say, well, does that cause a problem with the half shafts? Does it cause a problem with the brake lines? In fact, some of the cars, the ND in particular comes to mind, we found that when you put a big oversized tire on it and you put the stock shocks on, the wheels would hit the brake lines. So we actually artificially limited our droop travel a couple of millimeters just to protect the brake lines. It's a weird little thing we do, but that's kind of the whole process of doing platform-specific engineering, where you get the car and you set it up like you're going to use it for performance use, not just the stock tires, but a big fat tire with race alignment, and do all the kinematics on it and see what you need the shock to be. We actually figure out exactly what we need in a shock and then design a shock to suit. So our shock, the length, the stroke, the body, all, and the spring rates, that's all exactly what we want to do. Then we give that information to our supplier, which in this case is Tractive. So we were able to get a whole bunch of bump travel. So for reference, the NC Zetas are 126, so within a couple millimeters of stock. We have a tiny bit more bump travel than stock, but in the front NC, if you go up too much, you basically hit the fender liners and hit the hard fender. There's no more room for the tire. So we were able to get a little bit more, but not a lot more. And that's basically where we stopped. On the rear, the factory stroke is about 185 millimeters. We went to 171. So the difference with ours is we actually have more bump travel than stock. So if the factory range is, let's say here, we have a little bit less droop, but we have a whole bunch more bump travel. So with the set of Zetas, your rear tire will go up further into the fender than it does with the stock one. So the stock suspension, if you have a bone stock NC, pull the spring out, the tire will, if that's the fender, you imagine the tires here, it completely tucks up inside of there. With Zetas, it basically goes even further. The nice thing about that is it allows you to lower the car a little bit. You still have a whole bunch of bump travel even when the car is lowered. So the scenario is you're on a racetrack and you've already got the car, hunkered down in a turn and it's lowered, and you have a big round curb on the apex and you want to nip that curb to basically straighten your line through the turn or help the car rotate. It's not going to bottom out the suspension, or if it does, it's going to do it in a very controlled fashion and then rebound properly on the other side. So that bump travel is really, really important. And then on the other side, you've got all that near OEM droop travel to get the tire to hook back up instead of coming up off the ground and then bouncing. It's going to basically plant that tire. So the travel is a big feature of this. And just for comparison, in social media, we've had a lot of people ask about the Ohlins DFE and how they compare to these. They're really different animals. We have a whole separate video about two-piece shocks versus one-piece shocks. Ohlins DFE rear stroke is 90 millimeters. Ours is 171. And there is a special version by a shop here in the US that does a custom mix and match that does an 111 millimeter stroke rear Ohlins. But again, it's still 111 versus our 171 versus 185 of the stock. And those Ohlins, I know from measuring them here at the shop, they actually don't have more bump travel in stock, depending on how you adjust them. If you adjust them where they have any kind of droop travel, they actually have less bump travel in stock. In other words, they don't allow the tire to go up as much. So if your car's lowered, you have radically less bump travel than stock. And our experience, we actually did some comparative analysis driving some NCs and NDs on the Ohlins DFE shocks. I will say this, those shocks are supremely well made. If you've ever had one in your hand, they're gorgeous. They're really good materials. They're really tight tolerances. It's a good basic design of how to do a seal and how to do a piston. All that stuff's really good. The downside is that little bit of that shallow stroke. So when we drove them, what I personally noticed as a guy who developed suspensions is even on the stiffest settings, they lacked that nice nose of compression and rebound. It was close, but they needed a little more. It was good for medium sporty driving and mild HPD, but if you're really sending it on really grippy tires, they didn't have quite enough low speed rebound or compression. What they did do really well, and I'll be honest, it was really close to the Zetas in terms of sensitivity, is the high speed damping. That's all the little cracks in the pavement, where if you have the stock Bilsteins in an NC, the car kind of has a jittery, busy feel. You drive with the DFEs and all that's gone. All those little cracks in the pavement and stuff, that's absorbed just like the NC Zetas. They do the same thing. They just soak all that little stuff up that the factory Bilsteins don't do. But that's the only thing they do well. The problem was, we have a test loop here that we run our Zetas on all the different platforms that we run them on. It's got a bunch of lips. It's got one particular road. It's got embedded tree roots where the roots are up onto the pavement. So you drive over it and there's a big sharp lump, and sometimes it's both tires. Sometimes it's too close together. Some of them are within the wheelbase. Some of them are outside of the wheelbase. Sometimes it's just one tire. And we drive over that road, and with NC Zetas, the simple goal is it has to be able to soak that stuff up with the car lowered. And we drove the DFEs on it, no matter what we did with the settings, it bottomed 40 times on that road. And most of the time it bottomed pretty well. They control bottoming really well. They do bottom actually pretty well, but they bottom constantly. And the same NC Zeta would go through that same road 20 miles an hour faster and never bottom once. And that's that's at a lower setting than we had with the Zeta, with the DFEs. So there's a difference. They do certain things really well. When the roads are smooth, they're great. And when the roads have just a lot of tiny little bumps, they're great. But anytime you start getting into the 1-2 inch tall bumps that you need to hit and soak up, they run out of travel. And they handle that really well, but they're bottoming and topping constantly, like constantly. But that's not grip. That's going to be basically unloading and overloading the contact patch. So those of you who have DFEs, I know you like the way they ride on smooth roads, but let's face it, you're driving a bumpy road and they're bottoming constantly and you're chasing the ride height thing. The reason I talk about the DFEs is because in social media, that is the one shock that these have seemed to be compared to the most. Again, it's apples to oranges. There's two entirely different types of product. And like I talked about in our two-piece versus one-piece shock video, if you can afford to spend $2,000 on it, you should probably spend the extra and get the full stroke that your car is capable of. If you're doing it to save money, then save money. But don't spend nearly one-piece shock money on a two-piece shock. So those of you who have DFEs on your car and love them, you know, drive on a set of Zetas, go over that same road 20 miles an hour faster and see what happens. I guarantee you, your eyes will be opened. And it's a common experience with people who, in fact, we have a whole bunch of testimonials on our website for people who've put our ND Zetas and our NA and B Zetas, and they've come from Ohlins, is the travel thing. It's like I couldn't, you know, they always say it, I can't believe how much a difference is. One just soaks up everything and the other one doesn't. One little side note I kind of wanted to mention here was the mounts. We've had some questions about this mounts, why they have these big welds here. The reason why is this cap is not just a flat piece on here. It's actually like a skirt. This cap has a skirt on it that it goes inside here so it overlaps. So we wanted to have two different welds. We wanted to separate the weldments to make this piece a little stronger. So this is actually machined with some holes in there, and then it's welded, so this outer is welded to the skirt that's on this piece. So that's why it has that kind of clunky looking weld there. And this is built the same way. This is like a tongue and groove setup, so the welds are separated. The idea was that no single weld ever holds the weight of the car. So this is kind of a chunky industrial piece. It's not exactly pretty like our front mounts are all shiny and pretty. But this is, it's going to be hidden in the car. You never see it. And the job of this is to be completely rigid, inflexible, and completely and utterly nuke-proof. And that's what we built. So it's not exactly a pretty delicate piece like some of the other stuff we make, but they're quite durable, and that was the intent. So talking about the spring rates, these are available with a race and a touring spring pack. So let me look at my notes here. The race spring packs are 11 and 7 kilo. That approximates to 616 and 392 inch-pounds. And the touring springs are 5 and 4 kilo. That approximates to 280 and 224 inch-pounds. And we don't have an intermediate setup, you know, like a sport setup. We just did the race and the touring. And the simple reason why, the race spring rates, they ride well enough to kind of cover the sport. Because if you want a sport setup, you do want it to handle better the touring. You want to get as close as you can to race car handling without sacrificing the ride too much. You don't mind a slightly firmer ride, but you don't want it to be really hard. That describes the race. The race actually ride really well. The race rates ride better than the factory Bilsteins. I know you're calling BS. I'm dead serious. Drive the car. You'll see what we're talking about. The race spring rates on NC Zetas, turning the shocks down all the way to full soft, they actually ride better than the factory Bilstein clubs. So that gives you some idea if you're a club owner. So there's no need for the sport thing. You get all the maximum handling that you can get on the track just by turning the damping back up and cranking the damping up to the stiffing settings and cranking up that low speed compression and rebound. On the touring settings, our goal was basically to preserve the ride quality, and not the club, because the clubs have that kind of busy, jittery ride. It's really the factory Showa shocks, the ones that are kind of boaty and give it that sort of that yacht meme going on. For the NC ones, they do ride nice. They handle terrible. You know, they're just terrible, unresponsive, dull shocks. The factory Showas are. That's the black shock. But they do actually ride pretty nice. They absorb bumps pretty well, and they're not busy. And we wanted to get as close as we could to that sort of that butteriness, but that when you turn the wheel, instead of it, you know, leaning over and making you seasick, the thing actually takes a set and scoots around the turn and is nice and solid. And if you go through a fast whoopy kind of road, it's not walling around and making you seasick. It just feels tight and responsive. That's what we were able to do with the touring springs. So these are about 50% stiffer springs than the factory springs. But you have that control with the damping. You can run the damping really soft if you go along a freeway drive and you want it to just float and be cushy. But if you want to tighten up and do some autocross and track days, you can get way tighter handling than the factory shocks, you know, because you've got 50% more spring rate and a ton more damping capability and a better damping profile than the factory. And so I guess the way we would break this down in terms of choosing, the same way we do with, you know, all the other Zetas. Pick one that's your primary goal, your job one in your project, and then have the second thing that you don't mind being slightly less good at. So in terms of performance, if you're looking for the absolute best grip, responsiveness, performance for HPD, autocross, road racing, endurance racing, whatever it is, and you don't mind being a little bit firmer ride, a little tighter ride, so you don't have that kind of floaty ride like it's capable on the soft springs, then you're going to do the race rates. If you want the best possible ride quality, but you don't want to have it be a yacht, you want to be able to adjust it firm so you can go do autocross and track days, then you want the touring rates. So if ride quality is job one, touring rates. If performance and grip is job one, then you're doing the race rates. So I think that covers pretty much everything I wanted to cover on the NC Zetas. Reach out to us, email, phone call, follow us on Facebook and on Instagram. I think that covers it. We'll see you at the track.